Creepshow is a 1982 movie that was made in homage to horror comics from the 1950s and 60s. Directed by George A. Romero and debuting Stephen King's screenwriting career, this film is truly something special. The stories are simple but capture emotion, especially fear, incredibly well, and show us characters that feel raw and real, even pulling back the mask of our usual humanity to show us how devious we can be when we see a simple, promising opportunity. We see performances from a young Ed Harris, young Ted Danson, and Leslie Nielsen, who's younger, but I mean, he's still pretty old. I've only known this guy as an old guy, he's like the grandpa that's always been a grandpa kind of deal for me. In that same boat, that same like genre of person, if that makes sense. But it also has a character portrayal by Stephen King himself. And since this is an anthology, the characters and stories are incredibly unique and explore ideas and morality with rapidly increasing stakes and endings that are usually abrupt and thought-provoking. Not to mention that the lighting and transitions feel like they are ripped directly from the pages of a comic book. The love and passion that went into this film is clearly evident, and even by today's standards, I'd say that this movie is comfortably among the bests. So, strap in and hold tight as we talk about what happens in Creepshow 1982. When we open, we see the story that connects these other stories. Billy is a rambunctious kid, and the absolute mad lad is getting berated for bringing a comic book into the house. Stan, who's Billy's father, is outraged, going so far as to smack the kid before storming outside and throwing that devil comic in the trash.
That's why God made fathers, babe. That's why God made fathers.
That night, Billy wishes his father would rot in hell when a figure suddenly appears in the window. He and the figure share in a smiling contest before turning animated and giving us our title card. The first story of the anthology is titled Father's Day. Our four characters, Sylvia, Richard, Hank, and Cass, are all gathered to celebrate. They begin discussing their Aunt Bedelia, and we learn that when she was younger, she killed her father after he killed the man that she loved. They say that every year on Father's Day, she comes to the house where she killed her father so that she can celebrate. And since each of them have benefited from the father's death, none of them really seem to care that she's gotten away with murder. Bedelia arrives and goes to visit her father's grave and begins to remember how awful he was. We see that he's rude and selfish, and more than anything that he demands cake for his Father's Day celebration. As he's shouting his demands, Bedelia gets so angry that she grabs a marble ashtray and bashes her father over the head. In the present, she begins to drink from a bottle of Jack, ranting about how that day was the final straw, how he never should have killed the man that she loved, and how he deserved the death that he got. Suddenly, a zombified father bursts from the grave and, just as in life, he begins demanding cake. He grabs and strangles Bedelia when she can't give him the desired pastry. Hank goes outside and lights his cigarette in the coolest way possible, and then he wanders down to the graveyard to check on Aunt Bedelia. He calls her name but hears no reply. As he's searching, he finds the bottle of Jack and takes a swig before the ground beneath him gives out and he falls into the open grave. He looks up in shock to see that the headstone is tilting towards him, becoming more and more unstable as he tries to move and get out of the grave. He finds Bedelia's body before he sees a shadow and he becomes petrified by fear once he sees the dessert-loving zombie. With his scream, the headstone becomes unstable and falls, crushing him inside the grave. Meanwhile, Sylvia goes to check on the kitchen staff, but she notices a trail of muddy footprints leading into the kitchen. She goes in, but is grabbed by the zombie, and when she has no cake to offer, he snaps her neck. Richard and Cass then go to investigate the commotion, and when they get into the kitchen, they see that the zombie has finally gotten his Father's Day cake. Everyone screams, and Father's Day comes to an end. I like to try and take lessons from every story that I read, watch, or hear, so I've interpreted the meaning of this one down to one simple life rule. And that rule is, don't kill your dad. Like, even if he's demanding cake, don't kill your dad. And with that life lesson out of the way, our next story is called The Lonesome Death of Jordy Verrill. We open on a farmer named Jordy Verrill. Jordy watches as a meteor strikes down on his farm, and he goes to investigate. The rock is glowing green and steaming. When Jordy tries to touch it, the rock burns his fingers. But this doesn't stop him from getting ambitious with his fantasy of selling the meteor. In this fantasy, Jordy is able to swindle the silly meteor scientist into giving him a whole $200 in exchange for the meteor. There's a couple of these fantasies throughout this little short, and they all have the same actor in it. It's kind of fun. It's just a cute little thing they do. I really liked it. Seeing his opportunity for some quick cash, Jordy runs and grabs a bucket of water to cool the meteor off. While he's collecting the water, he notices that where he touched the rock, his fingers have begun to blister. Jordy then dumps the water onto the rock, but is horrified to see that it's now cracked in two. He has another fantasy, but this time since the meteor is broken, and we all know that a broken meteor is just no good, the scientist only offers him a lousy 50 cents. Despite him not believing it's very valuable anymore, Jordy decides to try and sell it anyway. He dumps the water out of the meteor and puts the pieces inside of the bucket. But we can see that where the water was dumped, a green bubbling liquid has now developed. Jordy goes inside to watch some TV, and we can see that outside growths have begun to sprout all over the farm. Jordy even notices green growth sprouting on his fingers where he had touched the meteor. Before Jordy calls a doctor, he has another fantasy, this time showing what he thinks the doctor's visit would be like. In the fantasy, the doctor says that the only option is for the fingers to come off. He pulls out a meat cleaver, scaring Jordy out of the fantasy and ensuring that he will definitely not be calling that physician. Jordy suddenly snaps a hand over his mouth and wanders into the bathroom. He looks in the mirror and we see that the growths have now sprouted on his tongue. Later, we can see that things have gotten out of control. The farm is completely overrun by growths, and Jordy is no exception to this. Jordy goes to take a bath, hoping to get rid of the itch that the growths cause, but he's stopped by a hallucination of his father in the bathroom mirror. The father tells Jordy that the growths want water, but the growths are too strong for Jordy to fight. He looks at the crystalline water and then dives in, exclaiming that he feels so much better now. We cut to the next morning and see the entire farm, house, and Jordy himself are covered in growths like a blanket of chia pets. Jordy climbs up from the floor and grabs a shotgun and decides that he is out of options and takes his own life. As we zoom out, we hear a news report of multiple instances of these growths overcoming the local area, and then the story ends. So, what's the life lesson that we can learn from Jordy? If you need to fight plants, use shotgun. Don't use water. Use shotgun. Now, it's hard to say which of the anthology stories are my favorite, but this next one is definitely a contender for that top slot. This one is called Something to Tide You Over, and has some of the most fun characters and moments in the entire film. Harry receives a knock on his door, and we are quickly introduced to Richard, who reveals that he's found out about the affair that Harry has been having with his wife, Rebecca. Richard plays a tape for Harry, and we hear Rebecca is screaming for help, saying that she's been trapped and that if Harry doesn't agree to go with him, that Richard will do something awful to her. Richard then takes Harry on a drive, warning him that if he tries anything, then Rebecca will die as punishment. They go to Richard's private beach and beach house, and on the beach is a hoe and shovel that Richard commands Harry to get into and pull sand on him so that he'll be incapacitated. He promises that once Harry is completely covered, he will be shown Rebecca. A quick cut later and Harry is completely covered, only leaving his head sand-free. Richard runs off, coming back a bit later with a TV that he places in front of Harry. He turns on the TV, and we see that Rebecca is in a very similar situation. She's covered by sand, but the tide has begun to wash over her. She's screaming for help, and Richard reveals that she is buried just a few miles down the beach, closer to the water than Harry is. Richard monologues about how it's possible to survive if Harry can hold his breath long enough before he drives away, leaving Harry with only the TV of his love's doom to keep him company. We watch Harry as the tide slowly creeps in, covering him more and more, and his breathing becomes frantic. Meanwhile, back at the beach house, Richard is watching the fate of the two scorned lovers. Leslie Nielsen in this role plays a villain that I can only really describe as comfortably evil. He sits back, sipping his drink, content with what he feels is justice for his wife being taken from him by another man. The water covers Harry more and more, and with nothing else to do, he stares at the camera and swears that he'll get Richard for this someday. Then, we see Harry's final breath in this awesome scene. The next morning, Richard goes back to the beach to retrieve his electronics. He sees that one of the cables has been cut, but is convinced that Harry has died and his body was pulled out to sea. In the night, Richard is looking for something to watch when he hears someone call his name. He searches the house but finds nothing, laughing it off as his own paranoia. But later, he hears someone walking around the house, and he grabs a gun from a nearby drawer. He hears someone on the other side of a door and demands they show themselves before he pulls the doors open. On the other side are the bloated, seaweed-covered undead forms of Harry and Rebecca. As Harry stumbles closer, Richard shoots him, but it does little to hinder Harry's revenge. When he's out of bullets, Richard even throws his gun and runs, locking himself into a bathroom. But when he turns around, the zombies are there waiting for him. They grab him, saying they want to take him to the beach. And then we cut and see that Richard is buried in the sand with only his head left uncovered. The water slowly creeps in, and Richard shouts,
I can hold my breath for a long time!
I think that the lesson in this one is quite obvious. The lesson is that ocean zombies are way worse than regular zombies. Because zombies are scary and the ocean is scary, and two scary is more than one scary, so ocean zombies more scary than regular zombies. Our penultimate story is called The Crate. A janitor chases his flipped coin to a grate beneath the stairs. When he looks under, he sees a crate marked that it was from an Antarctic expedition in the early 1800s. We cut over to a house party where we meet a professor named Henry and his wife Wilma. Wilma is
annoying.
She's loud and obnoxious and is getting more and more drunk by the minute, and we can see that the other guests are already tired of her. She's also very bossy to Henry, who usually replies to everything she says with a "yes, dear." At the party, we also meet Professor Stanley, who is a good friend of Henry's, and he agrees to join him for a chess match later that evening. During the party, Professor Stanley gets a call from the janitor, and since Professor Stanley is an expert in zoology, he seemed like the perfect person to call. Something about the crate's description piques the professor's interest, and he immediately leaves the party to go and have a look. Henry has a fantasy of himself shooting Wilma in the head, and he's met with a myriad of applause. But of course that didn't actually happen, and when Henry comes to, he and Wilma are both ready to leave the party. Going back to the janitor and Professor Stanley, they investigate the crate to see that it is chained and padlocked closed. They pull the crate from beneath the stairs and hoist it into the lab. The janitor swears that he feels something moving inside, and he goes to get a hammer and chisel so that they can open it. Henry has another fantasy where he strangles his wife before he comes to, and we find that Wilma is just heading out for the night. Professor Stanley and the janitor pry open the crate, but they hear a strange chirping sound coming from inside. The janitor leans in, and he thinks he sees something shining back at him, which he assumes is gemstones. He reaches inside but is grabbed by something. As he tries to pull his arm out, the crate tips over and he is pulled completely inside, giving us our first glimpse of the creature that lives inside the crate. Professor Stanley runs out of the lab where he encounters a student named Charlie. He tries to explain the situation, but he's in full-blown panic mode, and he can't properly articulate himself. Charlie decides to go see the crate for himself, thinking that the professor may be going crazy. The creature has dragged its crate back beneath the stairs, and Charlie tries to get closer, pulling out a mangled shoe from nearby the crate, before the creature suddenly attacks and kills Charlie on the spot. Not knowing what else to do, Professor Stanley runs to Henry's house. He's starting to lose it. He's laughing and crying and speaking nonsense as he tries to explain what's happened. Henry isn't sure what to believe. He can see the blood and he knows that whatever has happened, his friend is in trouble. Henry puts a sedative in Professor Stanley's drink and he goes to the school to investigate for himself. He leaves a note for Wilma telling her to meet him at the school when she gets home, and when he gets to the lab, he's surprised by the amount of carnage that's left behind. He then begins to mop up the blood and is overall much more calm than he has any right to be. Wilma reads the note and joins Henry at the school a bit later, and when she gets there, we see that Henry may be up to no good. He begins to tell Wilma that Professor Stanley has attacked a student, and that the student is now hiding beneath the stairs. He says that the student is a young girl who refused to talk to Henry, so he's hoping that Wilma's motherly nature will be able to help the girl. Wilma looks beneath the stairs, and Henry pushes her closer to the crate. She turns and begins to berate and insult Henry, calling him useless and stupid, before the creature suddenly bursts from the crate and puts an end to Wilma's reign of obnoxiousness. Henry is able to secure a new padlock onto the chain, locking the creature and any evidence of the deaths inside. He then drives down to the quarry and dumps the crate into the depths below. When he gets home, Henry sees that Professor Stanley is awake, and they decide that since there are no bodies and no evidence of foul play, that they don't have to report or say anything. They then sit down and enjoy a friendly game of chess, not knowing that the creature may have escaped from the depths of the quarry. This is another one that I think could be a contender for my favorite short of the movie, and it's got another incredibly useful life lesson that we can all learn from, which is annoying spouses belong in the crate of quietness. Yeah, that works. Our fifth and final story of the film is called They Are Creeping Up on You. We follow Upson Pratt, who's just as snobby as his name sounds. He's a multimillionaire neat freak who treats all of his employees as if they were the scum of the earth. While he's on the phone, Upson gets distracted as a cockroach runs around his apartment. While he's hunting down the bug, he gets another call that one of his business competitors has taken his own life, which Upson thinks is wonderful news. He rants about how dirty the world is, seeing that a cockroach has climbed onto his own hand. He tips it and vacuums the bug away. Upson gets another call, this time from the widow of his competitor. He laughs and hangs up on her, then he makes a call to the building supervisor to get an exterminator for all of the bugs. He sits down to eat a pureed dinner, but as he's eating, he feels that the texture is off. He looks through the ingredients and finds a nest of bugs inside some of the boxes. The building supervisor shows up and tells the man that the exterminator will be there within the hour. But the bug problem is getting worse and worse. The bugs begin to cast shadows, showing that they are even infested up in the lights. Then hordes of bugs start crawling through the vents and pipes and swarm Upson. The power suddenly goes out, making the situation even worse. The bugs crawl all over his body and he's forced to retreat into his clean room. He gets a call in the room and we hear the widow's voice speaking as he pulls the covers of his bed back to find a whole swarm of cockroaches. Upson grabs his throat, panicking so much that he begins to struggle breathing. He collapses, and we cut to the morning, where we see Pratt's body begin to shake. Bugs begin to crawl through his skin and mouth, and in the end, we see the once clean room has now become a hive of pure cockroaches. The life lesson that we can learn from Upson Pratt is simple. Don't eat bugs. They may have looked good on The Lion King, but in real life, they're ew, I promise. To end Creepshow, we pull out of the comic and see that a couple of garbage men have picked it up to read. They look through the ads and find that one for the voodoo doll has been ripped out. We cut to see Stan now complaining about a pain in his neck, and then we cut and see Billy has bought that voodoo doll and is now stabbing its throat with a pin. Billy stabs the doll over and over, his father collapses to the ground, and then we end with Billy smiling. This movie is rad. Many scenes feel ripped from the pages of a comic, and each of the stories are fun and unique and clever. Each story takes a different path to get under your skin and latch onto your fears. Whether it's the tragic death of Jordy or the rantings as Richard is buried, the concepts of horror are there and ready to catch you off guard. If you enjoyed the breakdown but haven't seen the full movie, then I highly recommend you watch it, and I promise you won't be disappointed. It's got so much charm and effects that are definitely worth exploring for yourselves. So, which was your favorite story, and what life lessons did you glean from Creepshow? The movie was good enough to get a sequel, and there's a third movie too, but we can forget about that one, right? Let's forget about that one. But yeah, if you enjoyed the breakdown, don't forget to leave a like as well as subscribe. It helps the channel out a lot, it helps me out a lot as well. And for those of you who have made it this far, I hope you can find a Coke can that has your name on it spelled correctly for the first time ever. I know I really wish I could. But yeah, My name is Creed, and this has been Writer's Blockbuster. Bye-bye!
Slap, 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 clap, 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 slap, 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 clap, clap, clap.